get started. First of all, let me introduce myself. I'm Dr. Arthur Hirsch. I'm director of Webster University in Vienna here. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this panel discussion on trafficking in human beings, bringing some different international perspectives on a very pressing and important global issue. As you know, we often extol globalization as a very positive development. It's allowed for the free movement of peoples, goods, services. With communication and transportation now, it's possible to talk to people anywhere in the world almost instantaneously and to travel almost anywhere in the world very easily. And many good things have come from this, but also some bad things, because it's made it easier for criminal activity to take place, whether it's drug trade or illegal weapons trade, or this kind of crime, the trafficking in human beings, which involves, in effect, a new form of modern-day slavery. And it's an issue that we have been learning about as it's developed, especially in the last 15 to 20 years. The media has paid attention to it. CNN, for example, has a project on what's called the Freedom Project, which highlights conditions of involuntary servitude of a variety of forms. When we talk about human trafficking, the most obvious and the most, in some ways, the most dramatic form is of the young lady from the Ukraine or where have you, who is told about a wonderful job in Vienna, modeling or working as a waitress in a restaurant, and she agrees to go with someone to Vienna and gives her passport to the person and finds herself being drugged, being forced into prostitution, and being unable to get out of it, being in effect a prisoner of the traffickers and the people that they work with. That's, as I say, the most dramatic form of human trafficking. It's been highlighted in many films in the last few years. Some of you may be familiar with The Whistleblower, which is an account of a real-life incident in Bosnia-Herzegovina, which is extremely troubling because it involved UN peacekeepers, as well as authorities in Bosnia in the entire process. But that's only one form of trafficking, and maybe we'll hear about the other kinds of human trafficking, which involve child labor, and not just in prostitution, but in other areas, forced agricultural labor, forced sweatshop factory labor, construction labor. There are some estimates that up to 250 million children are involved in child labor today. And these are things, as a historian, that I used to teach about as something of the worst part of the Industrial Revolution of the early 19th century. Yeah, here we are in the early 21st century, and we seem to have similar phenomena. All right, we're lucky tonight to have a very distinguished panel of experts to present different views on the issues. We have two diplomats, one from Austria, one from the United States, and we have a former Austrian government minister, and we have an NGO activist who works directly with the victims of trafficking. Ambassador Dr. Elisabeth Tichy-Fieselberger, sitting to my left, has a long career with the Austrian Diplomatic Service, the Austrian Foreign Ministry, and has held, well, first worked for a number of years in the European Commission and has done held many responsibilities related to EU questions, but she has also been the permanent representative of Austria to the EU in Brussels, and she is currently also the national coordinator for the fight against human trafficking. And we're going to hear from her. She's also lecturing at the Diplomatic Academy at the University of Vienna, so she's familiar with student audiences. And as I know, Mr. Christopher Ho, the Deputy Chief of Mission of the United States Embassy here in Vienna, is, as well as he has been the Associate Dean of the Foreign Service Institute of the United States Department of State. He's got a lot of experience in this part of the world and in the Balkans, having been director of the South Central European Affairs in the State Department, and overseeing U.S. policy and programs related to Albania, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Croatia, Kosovo, Macedonia, Montenegro, and Serbia. And before being Deputy Chief of Mission here in Vienna, he also served in this capacity at the U.S. Embassy in Bosnia from 2000 to 2003. Dr. Helga Conrad is a former Austrian Minister of Women's Issues in the Austrian government. And in fact, she's one of the earliest people to raise this issue in a public forum, and she organized the first EU conference on trafficking in women for the purpose of sexual exploitation. This conference took place here in Vienna in 1996, and she's been involved in a number of other such conferences in China and the OSCE. She was the OSCE Special Representative for the fight against trafficking in persons from 2004 to 2006, and she's currently an independent consultant on combating trafficking in human beings, as well as the project leader for the Austrian Institute of International Politics on this issue. And then our fourth speaker, Eva Kaufman, is working for an NGO, LEFAL, which is the Latin American Immigrant Women's Organization in Austria. It's actually began dealing with the issues of Latin American women in Austria, but it has expanded over the more than 25 years that they've operated here to dealing with the issues for all migrant women in Austria. And Eva can bring the perspective of someone who's working directly with the victims of trafficking. I'm going to ask the speakers to give a short presentation of 5 to 10 minutes each, and then give them an opportunity to respond to each other's presentations, and then we'll open it up to you folks for questions. Okay? So, Ambassador Tichy Fieselberger, if you want to start us off.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me. It's always very interesting for us to be able to do some awareness raising for this subject, which still in the larger public audience is not that well known. Let me start with a case, just to show you what the case of human trafficking can be like in this part of the world. And also as an answer to the title of tonight's event, which is Trafficking in Human Being, International Perspectives. I would argue that human trafficking is always international. There's no such thing as national human trafficking. Well, the case started in Great Britain. A gang was found out to transfer 180,000 euros, which is $250 million, from one account to another, and in the event got arrested. It turned out that that money, $250,000, had been earned by 160 children in just 1 month. They tracked the perpetrators and found 17 rather pretentious villas in eastern Romania, in a part of the world which is known to be very poor. Now, they found the perpetrators. They didn't pay attention to the children. And it so happened that the children got lost. Some of them had to work for other gangs later on. And it just happened that one of these child victims ended up in Vienna, in an institution which takes care of child victims, and told her story. And this is the interesting bit which I'm now going to tell you, to hand on to you. Now, this girl had been forced to steal during weeks. She was about 12 or 13. If she didn't steal enough money during the week, she would be forced into prostitution over the weekends. She would have 14 clients on average on one weekend. She was given for that 150 euros. We think we know that one client would have paid at least 200 euros, one client, and she had 14. And when she was finally saved by this institution, she wasn't even aware she was a victim. She said she earned much better than her father at home, who earned about 120 euros for an entire month. That was in Romania. So you see, human trafficking, child trafficking has a lot to do with globalization, as you said, with the fact that countries are rather close to one another. It's easy to travel, but at the same time we have enormous differences between countries, between the average level of standard of living in different countries, and this is what explains so much what human trafficking is all about in Europe. It has to do with the fall of the Iron Curtain, with the consequences which you can still see, and with the fact that criminal gangs were much faster in developing their networks than the public authorities. And these criminal networks which exist, they are used for drugs trafficking, they're used for arms trafficking, they're used for human trafficking, they're used for all kinds of organized crime, and they are very efficient. And the estimates are today that human trafficking is the third most lucrative form of organized crime and is the least risky one. So that is what we are talking about. In a world where, remember, 1 in every 7 persons is a migrant. We have an age of migration which is unprecedented. At the time when traveling is easy, there are entire countries where literally everybody wants to move away, and at the same time we have, in particular in Europe, very strict regulations, in particular with Schengen, which make it more or less impossible to have legal migration for such work. So this is where we are. I'm trying to make it short, although I could tell you many, many stories. The major forms of human trafficking which we find in this part of the world is number 1, prostitution, forced prostitution. That accounts for about 80%, we think, of the cases we have, which means that the huge majority of victims are female, women or girls. Then we have forced labor, which, however, is on the increase, in particular with the economic crisis which we all have, with globalization, with an aging society, where you need cheap labor and all that. So we have to watch, in particular in agriculture, in construction, in restaurants and things like that. So there are various branches of cheap labor, very often dirty work, where labor exploitation happens. There is child trafficking, as I already mentioned. There is trafficking in human organs. We think very little here in Austria, but it does exist in Europe, of course, and there are other forms of human trafficking as well. Now, what's international about this? There is absolutely no lack of legal instruments. There are legal instruments, what have you, international ones, European ones. They all have in common that they give definitions of what human trafficking is, which is usually a combination of an action which is to transport a person, a bad intention, which is to exploit them, and very often the use of threat or force. In Europe, we also have legal instruments, both from the Council of Europe and from the European Union, which also deal in detail with the way victims have to be treated. There's the one convention of 2005 by the Council of Europe, which is very comprehensive, and very recently a directive by the European Union was adopted which goes into detail, which foresees stricter sanctions. I'm not going to enter into the details now, but I'm happy to answer any question which you might have later on. Now, this most recent European directive legal instrument has to be implemented within the next 2 years, and here in Austria we are working. Now, what does one do with this phenomenon, this breathtaking phenomenon? The international jargon talks about the 4 Ps, which is the persecution of the perpetrators, prevention in particular, trying to avoid things before the damage is done, protection of victims, and partnership, international partnership, and arguably there is no success which any country can achieve in this area without international partnership, without international cooperation. And this cooperation is both about police cooperation, the cooperation of law enforcement, but also the cooperation of those who try to deal with the victims, who try to help prevent what is taking place. What we're doing today, in a way, is part of prevention, because we're doing awareness raising. We are trying to attract your attention to this phenomenon of human trafficking, which is not that present in the media, but which is gaining in importance, and we would be grateful if you spread the message just to your colleague that this is going on and we all have to keep an eye. Yes, I think I would stop here. Having mentioned that we have a lot of international organizations based here in Vienna which one way or another deal with the subject matter. There is the UN, as you know, UNODC, the United Nations Office for Drugs and Crime, is the competent branch of the United Nations dealing with human trafficking, and they're actually very active. They have quite a number of projects going on. There is OECE, based in Vienna as well, which has a special representative for dealing with combating human trafficking, and Helga Conrad, who is present here, was the first such special representative. Now there is a successor, but OECE goes on. It's one of the first organizations to have really started combating the phenomenon and raising the country's awareness to it. There is also UN GIFT, as it's called. It's a kind of conglomerate of various organizations which try to work together from Vienna in combating human trafficking, and there are others. In Austria, just as a last note, we have a national action plan which runs over 3 years, where we set ourselves a certain number of objectives which we want to achieve in all these various areas, from prevention over the protection of victims to the prosecution of the perpetrators. And I'm happy to answer any questions you might have later on, but I think I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you. Right, to hear another diplomatic perspective, say from the American government, Mr. Ho.
Great, thank you, Dr. Hirsch, and let me say also how happy I am to be here. I think for all of us who are practitioners in whatever field, it's good to be in a gathering that includes students. Nothing against those of you who are no longer students here, but the students usually keep us on our toes, as we say in English. They often ask some of the most thought-provoking questions. But I wanted to say that from the US perspective, we feel human trafficking is both a very important problem and one that affects every country in the world. Just to quote briefly from President Obama, he observed that human trafficking is a global travesty that takes many forms and is an affront to our values as a nation and as human beings. I think that's an important perspective, that if you want to be a human being, you can't really ignore a problem like this that is so devastating. I'm delighted to share a panel with such distinguished practitioners, and I should also mention Dr. Geertz over there, who goes back to my time in Bosnia, where we dealt with some of these problems when I was there. And finally, just to end the thank yous to Dr. Hirsch and Webster for organizing this panel. I thought I would try in my 5 to 10 minutes to touch very quickly on 4 things. One is the United States report on trafficking in persons, which I think is an important document for people to be aware of. A little bit about the situation in the United States. A little bit, very little bit, about Austria, since we have all the Austrian experts here. And then just a word on the cooperation bilaterally between Austria and the United States. But to give you the headline up front, it's good. Let me just say that the United States has our Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in the Department of State, in our Foreign Ministry, and it is responsible for this annual Trafficking in Persons report. Now I'm just curious, how many people here have ever heard of this report? Just show me your hands. Okay, a few. That's fine. It's a relatively new document. It was first published in 2001, and it's required by our Congress that we put out and publish a report that looks at every country in the world, including the United States, and describes both what's going on and what governments and authorities are doing to combat the trafficking. So today's report now covers 184 different countries and territories, and each country's narrative is different. Each country has to be looked at as its own case. But the formula, again, as part of our legislation, is to rank countries. Tier 1 is the best. That grade applies to 30 countries, which includes Austria, includes the United States, Germany, France, South Korea, several others. To Tier 3, which is the worst grade, the most area for improvement. And countries like Sudan and North Korea come into mind. And it's based on the government's performance in 3 areas, 3 of the P's that Ambassador Tiki Fieselberger talked about. Prevention, protection, and prosecution. So maybe at some point we'll look at partnership too. The report is really the primary diplomatic tool that the U.S. uses to encourage cooperation, particularly in countries where cooperation might be not coming automatically from the local authorities. And it is to fight against forced labor, sexual exploitation, and all forms of modern-day slavery. I think I'll save for the discussion a few case studies and other things, including a bit from my time in Bosnia. But I'll just mention that 2011 was the 10th anniversary of having that report. And like many initiatives over the years, I think it's become refined and gotten better. And so I commend it to you. For those of you who haven't checked it out, if you're interested, you can look it up on the web. So now the second thing, the United States. Like Austria, the United States is a Tier 1 country, meaning that it meets or surpasses the minimum standards for combating human trafficking. But it's important to recognize that no country, including my own, has ever really reached a comprehensive, perfect approach to dealing with this problem. The traffickers and other criminal organizations are innovative and entrepreneurial. They adapt. They use technology. They find ways to respond to the measures that the authorities take. So it's a massive problem, but it's an ever-changing kind of crime. And so we in our governments and other authorities have to respond to that. And bureaucracies are not known for necessarily being innovative and entrepreneurial. But we do try, and I think in the Austrian case and the US case, we do a pretty good job. In any case, in 2011, the report said that trafficking in the US occurs for commercial sexual exploitation, that's things like street prostitution, massage parlors, brothels, and also for forced labor, which could be domestic service, people think about that, but also it happens in agriculture, it happens in manufacturing, it happens more and more in the healthcare field. These are all things that need to be looked at. And I think it's worth noting that in my country and others, there's a perception that human trafficking is all about undocumented workers, the migrants that we've heard about tonight already. But in fact, we also find that people who are documented and legitimately, legally in a country may also be subject to human trafficking, may also be exploited, and even people who live within a country in the United States, we found in some cases, there are American-born, American citizens, victims, both adults and children. The 2011 report recommended that the U.S. focus on better data collection, that we increase our outreach in human trafficking, particularly in rural areas and immigrant communities, and that we should promote better cooperation among our federal, state, and local levels of government. But I'll mention that in the United States, some aspects of our approach include task forces. We actually have 39 task forces across the country that are funded by the federal government, but comprise NGOs, civil society representatives, local law enforcement, state law enforcement, to combat the trafficking problem in particular areas, geographical areas of the country. Another element of the U.S. approach is a victim-centered approach, to look at the victims, what was their history, what are their needs now, to not only offer services, but build trust. And I imagine we'll hear more about that later from some of the people who work in that field. Our approach also includes some temporary waivers for immigration rules, so that the immigration rules, the kinds of things that might lead you to deport someone, can be relaxed in the period of recovery and in the period of investigation. And then, of course, we have services for victims, shelter, health care, legal services, and that kind of thing. So, the third thing I wanted to mention is Austria, also a Tier 1 country, only one of 30 in the world, meaning that it meets or surpasses the standards for combating human trafficking. The 2011 report commended Austria for the services provided to female trafficking victims, as well as its leadership in the region. And it's not something that I think Ambassador Tiki Fieselberger went into in detail, but the Austrian role in working with neighboring countries and working in Southeast Europe and bringing the European Union experts here at least annually to coordinate really is one of the things that I think the Austrians are contributing greatly to international cooperation. It's not something that's necessarily publicized here, but it's something that deserves, I think, a lot of credit. So thank you for those efforts. In Austria, our perception is the coordination between the government and the non-governmental sector is very good. We'll hear more about that. But I know that we will be meeting, in fact, with a roundtable soon of people across the Austrian government and from civil society to find out and learn more about how the work is going forward to combat trafficking. I have to mention the report did make some recommendations, particularly suggesting that in Austria, the sentences should be increased for the convicted human traffickers, that measures could be taken to enhance the identification of victims, and to finally improve the specialized care for children who have been victims of trafficking. Nevertheless, those are, in the grand scheme of things, relatively small areas for improvement, and I'm sure that the government is already taking that seriously. Finally, bilateral cooperation between Austria and the US, I think I've said it, it's good. In particular, as I mentioned, Ambassador Tiki Fieselberger has organized these big roundtable meetings. That is, we view a best practice. We wish other countries would do the same. It's an immediate way of recognizing that the government authorities, the NGOs, the foreign diplomats are all different members of the same team working to combat this problem. And we save a lot of time. We do a lot of dispelling of myths by meeting in that way. And most of the perspective of the U.S. Embassy, where I'm working, and my colleagues there, we gain a lot of insights and information about how things are working in Austria, and that then feeds in through our reporting to the people who write the report in Washington, and that makes a big difference. There's also, of course, law enforcement cooperation, and that's an area day-to-day. We have FBI and Drug Enforcement Agency and people like that in Vienna in the embassy, and their day-to-day cooperation, I think, with the Austrian authorities is excellent. And I'll just mention one recent case where the cooperation between our two countries and with the Austrian police was instrumental to obtain a conviction for a human trafficker who had lured, that is, brought over under false pretenses, dozens of young women from Central and Eastern Europe to the United States to exploit them, to sexually abuse them himself. And in the end, we were able to get this conviction, put him in jail, and stop that operation only because of the cooperation of the Austrian authorities. So I'll quote again the words of President Obama: we are all continuing to work together to stand firm in defense of freedom and bear witness for those exploited by modern slavery. And I'll look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Conrad, in addition to being the Austrian government minister for women's issues, you've served in the Austrian parliament, and you've not only organized the first EU conference on this issue and participated in several others, but you chaired the EU Stability Pact Task Force in Anti-Trafficking for Southeastern Europe for 4 years, from 2004 to 2006, and then went on to be the OSCE Special Representative on trafficking issues for the next 2 years to 2006. So you've really been immersed in the issue. probably more so on a policy level and political level than any of the other panelists. And looking forward to what you would add to the discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I've just come back from the United States. By the way, I was at Stanford and at the University of Washington in Seattle. So I'm very glad to be here. But I would like to maybe to take a more undiplomatic perspective, if possible. Simply because, as you said, I've been working on this issue for quite a while, and human trafficking is not new. So it has taken on, it has been growing during recent years, and it has taken on an added dimension in this era of globalization. And as we have heard, there are many efforts being undertaken. But, and we all know we have formulated checklists, and we have minimum standards and standards in general, and we have hundreds of recommendations. And I think we would have to ask ourselves, so what's wrong? I mean, we are all so good, you know, in addressing human trafficking, and it's still there, you know. It's, we have not succeeded in coming to grips with this problem. So what I would like to do is to look a bit at the difficulties or at the assumptions on which we have been based, have based our approach to human trafficking so far, and to look a bit into what we should do better and should do more, really, because one thing is the theory, and the other thing is the practice. So my current work, or in my current work, we try together, of course, with others, because alone you can anyway not do anything in the fight against human trafficking, but together with others to put theory into practice. And then also, not each country alone, but together, because the responsibility is with the states and governments, individually and collectively, to fight human trafficking. So one problem, I think, is, and I repeat this, sorry for that, for those who have already heard me on this, I repeat very often, my feeling is that we have, meanwhile, learned to manage human trafficking somehow, but we are not combating it. So we just accept it's there, and we find ways of course, there are changes. I've been working on this issue for more than 25 years, and I remember a time when people told us, and authorities told us, well, we would like to do something, but there is no legislation. So meanwhile, legislation is there. Of course, legislation needs to be updated as new knowledge is available or new experience, but nevertheless, legislation is there. By the way, in Southeastern Europe and in Bosnia, I've also been in Bosnia. This whistleblower is one of the actual things where we were there and knew what was going on. So the idea of having coordination mechanisms, they go back, they date back to Southeastern Europe, and only afterwards other countries, European countries and also the United States, have taken on this idea to establish task forces in order to coordinate the various stakeholders. But of course, this is only half of the story, because it depends how these task forces work. And we know, coming from the United States, I know that there are tensions there, and of course there are tensions in Europe on this cooperation. We have to admit that human trafficking is so difficult to combat, because on the one hand it's so complex, it's a very complex issue, but on the other hand there are also different interests which are there. And this is what we do not really discuss and do not really try to solve. Just some examples. So for instance, when we speak about prevention, then very often we simply mean awareness raising. So awareness raising, that's fine, that's good, it's fine that you know, that others know that the problem is there. But prevention is more than that. It is looking into the root causes of human trafficking. It's looking into the situation in countries of origin. The root causes may be discrimination, for instance. They may be unemployment. This may be political situations, etc. So we have to look into that, and we have to do something in this regard. This is what we don't do. What we do is dealing mainly with the consequences of human trafficking. It's there, and we try to handle this problem somehow. But really, prevention is a long-lasting issue. It's also for politicians, I would say, not that much interesting because it's so long, you know, and sometimes the politicians are just very short in place, and then it's somebody else. So prevention really is a very difficult issue, and we do not really do that. We prefer awareness raising, and even with awareness raising, we do not really know what these awareness raising campaigns, what impact these awareness raising campaigns have. Not on the victims, not on the traffickers, not on our societies, whatever. So there is no, let's say, research or evidence or impact assessment on what we have been doing so far and what effects it really has. We simply believe and repeat and repeat and repeat that this what we do is fine. But if we look at the results, we must admit that we have not been. So far, we have not been so successful. And one more word on another pair, which is also very difficult. Countries look at human trafficking very often from the national security perspective. So it's the narrow view of national sovereignty, the national part, versus human rights, really. And I know that Eva Kaufmann later on can tell how difficult it is sometimes also for organizations trying to assist and protect victims of trafficking because of the fact that this national security part, it takes first place and the protection of human rights takes second place. And we know that there are already studies, they have looked into that, and they mention already the collateral damage which occurs by the fact that we don't really look into, or we don't really protect the human rights of the victims. Just an example, because sometimes these are only small things. So for instance, I don't know now, I must say, because some years ago I looked into that. But the US, the T visa in the United States, you can get a visa for victims of trafficking. But of course, the discrepancy between between the victims in the countries and people think, also authorities believe that some 14, 15, 17,000 new victims every year in the United States. And only a very few get a T visa. But the T visa is an excellent measure, you know, better than perhaps in other countries, because this is always a problem to provide an extended stay to victims of trafficking in a country. Because in Europe, for instance, we would believe offering an extended stay to victims of trafficking would attract more migrants, and this measure would be abused. So in the United States you have this T visa, but nevertheless, only very few victims get a T visa, and they charge a certain fee, or at least they did years ago. I must confess that I don't know whether this is still the case. So they charged, for instance, £200 for the T visa. So this would be something which is against the rights of victims. Even, you know, these the T visa, there is a possibility to waive this, but nevertheless, to impose a fee to get the permission to stay in a country is not what we should do, just as one small example. And the European Union, with the new EU directive, has now clearly stated that the conditionality is not to protect the victims must take place sorry, my English is already a bit of a check. In a not conditional, in an unconditional, yeah, must take place unconditional. In Europe, for instance, what we do is we tell the victims in many countries, you get assistance and support, but only if you cooperate with law enforcement, or only if you do this and that. And we know, and the new EU directive also states that this is counterproductive and of course should not be continued to be done. Well, there would also be much more to say. I don't know how long I am. Just two words. I think the main problems in the fight against human trafficking and why we are not really moving forward in combating this are 2 points. This is, on the one hand, the identification of trafficking situations, and on the other hand, it's the judiciary, really. As long as we don't identify trafficking situations, we have nothing. Yeah, we cannot protect victims. We cannot find the traffickers, etc. So this is the very weak point, and we know that the problem is huge. We believe that there are hundreds of thousands of people being trafficked every year around the world, and only a very small part is protected. And as an example, and this was, I read because I was also in California and saw that there is a case being filed on trafficking for labor exploitation. And this is very typical. The indicators, yeah, are so typical, but nevertheless, people fear that there will be no conviction of the traffickers. An example, a foreign contractor firm hired, in that case in California, Thai people, in another case in Europe, Indians, to work on a hospital or on a construction site in a specific countries. The passports of the people, of the workers, were taken away or kept in. They lived in incredible bad conditions. They got only very few money below everything. In Europe it was below a minimum wage, and when we addressed and they couldn't get out because they were threatened with various things. And when we addressed once the authorities on this was in Europe, in one country in Europe, they said, well, first of all, and this is so typical, why we are not, the authorities said, well, first of all, nobody complained. So this is one thing. Authorities wait and believe victims should come forward and say, oh, well, sorry, I'm a victim. Yeah? But this depends on so many things. We can discuss it afterwards. Then they said, oh, well, they don't earn, they have signed something which they had not even understood, you know, so they made them sign things, and then they said, well, they feel that they don't earn enough money. Well, this is not our problem. They should go and see the trade unions. Then with the fact that they were cramped together somewhere under bad living conditions, the authorities said, oh, well, they are Indians or Thai or whatever, they are used to that at home, you know, at home they live in even worse conditions. And on the passports, they said, well, if you go to another country, for instance, they also take your passport for 2 or 3 days because it's the procedures they have to do. So what I wish to say is simply, if we don't understand what makes it a trafficking situation, we won't see it, we won't know, and we won't be able to combat it. That's the problem. I mean, it's just a small part of it, but maybe I stop here.
Okay, thank you very much. Eva Kaufmann, our fourth speaker, works for LEFO, the main NGO in Austria offering assistance to victims of trafficking. Eva works directly with the victims in trying to help them get out of these terrible situations and to rebuild their lives. So Ava, I'm sure you have a lot you can tell us about.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. I'd like to present you yet another example of a woman that I met just before Christmas and who is a victim of trafficking according to the international definitions. But yet it will not be easy that she will be identified as such by the authorities, or she will fight through her case at court. I will sort of tell you why. And I will also, while I'm telling you this example, by this example, show you what it means to international perspectives for an NGO. I'm working for this part of LEFE. LEFE has different areas, different working fields, and one of it is the work we do with victims of trafficking, the assistance we give, and we are actually working since 1998. I'm part of this working field since 1999, so I have quite some experience as well in this field. Yeah, about the woman, about the case. She is Filipino. She is around 30 years old. She came to Austria because her sister was working for another lady whose sister is working in Austria and who is a diplomat here. She was looking for work because she just got divorced from her husband. She has 2 children and she needed money and she didn't know what to do. And then there was this offer from her sister if she wouldn't like to come. So I don't say that her sister is part of the trafficking chain because she also didn't know what would await her, but she could have been, because sometimes it's also relatives, you never know. So, okay, finally she decided to come to Austria. She even signed a contract, a working contract, in which was written that she would earn 800 something euro a month. She would work in the household. She would have 40 hours a day. She would have a day off, which would be the Sunday. She would only do housework without cooking and without looking after children. Yes, I think this was yes, and she would have health insurance and so on. So she thought it is a perfect job and she would do that. So she got in contact with her employer. They organized her travel, and when she was in Austria, first few days everything went all right, but her employer already took her passport because she said it would be better that she had it, well, that they kept it because it would be, well, more secure, or nobody else could steal it or so. So the woman didn't think, it's a bad thing to give her passport away, and she didn't even know the employer, and so she did that. Then in the first few days, as I said, everything was all right. It was a lot to do. The employer already asked her to look a bit after her baby, but as she liked babies, she didn't oppose to that. And during the next months, it developed more and more into a system of exploitation. So it wasn't there from the very beginning, but in the end, she really worked. Well, first of all, she didn't get the money. She didn't get anything. She only got food, and this was so little that she stayed hungry. She didn't have any days off. She did the cooking, she did the household, she was the babysitter all the time through. It was like that the mother even hardly ever had her baby with her, but the baby even slept with the woman I'm talking about. So she also had to get up in the night when the baby was crying, and she hardly got any sleep. She had to be up at 6 o'clock in the morning, and she worked through until, well, 10 p.m. or so. Her employer got her busy all the time. She was, when she did something wrong, or when she thought that she did something wrong, she was shouted at. She was like being called names, she was pushed, she was, yeah, a lot of things, and she really was in despair and didn't know how she could get out of that. Eventually, she got to know a neighbor, or somebody employed by the neighbor, because she was looking out of the window and they were sort of greeting each other. And she put into her mind that she could call her embassy. She was not allowed to use the phone, but somehow she managed to call her embassy, and her embassy encouraged her to just get a taxi, tell them they should go to the Philippine embassy in Vienna, and they would pay for her because she didn't have any money. She didn't have her passport, she didn't have any money, she was not allowed to go out, she didn't know anybody, so of course, what do you do then? So this was the time when she then took the step. She just took a moment, chose a moment when nobody watched her. She went out, she took a taxi like the embassy had told her, and went to the embassy, and that was how she got in contact with us in the end. So I listened to her story. I got in contact with the ministry. So this is how we work together in Austria, to ask them, do you know, what can we do? This lady seems to have a diplomatic status. Can we somehow do something on the diplomatic level? Because evidently it's very, very hard to do something on the police and court level. I have to say we have quite a good police cooperation and also cooperation with the judicial system in Austria. But, of course, in the case of diplomats, this is rather hard. That will also make it hard to get a legal permit to stay for this lady. But, of course, she has a right to compensation. She has a right to stay for some time in the country until she has relaxed, until she could overcome what has happened to her, and she has, of course, a right to have the money. And what's more, if people who exploit others gravely, if the consequence is not that they have to repay the money, they will go on doing that, because this is what they are doing it for. It's the money benefit. That's what they are doing it for. So that is why we think compensation is rather an important issue. And that is why we are also part of an NGO, European NGO network, who has chosen this topic to do lobbying on that topic for improving international as well as national legislation, for putting really a focus on that, raising the awareness of authorities as well, of courts, that compensation is really an important matter. We were successful in having an EU project, and we were researching in Austria what about compensation now and what should be the improvements. The results are in a book, which can be bought by in our office if somebody is interested. And but the project of Compact is a European one, so it means there are in other European countries also other NGOs are doing research. Some are not ready yet. The overall results will be published by the end of the year, and you will also be able to have a summary on our homepage in English if you like. Yeah, so this is compensation. In that case, we try on the diplomatic level, together with the help, with the support of the Ministry of the Exterior, to reach something for this lady. In other cases, of course, there is a possibility if you go to the penal court, that in the penal procedure you already make your claims, and the judge can not only sentence the perpetrator but also tell you that your claims are okay and you get so and so much money from the perpetrator. It doesn't mean you already have it, because evidently this is just on paper, and then you have to really invest a lot of work to really get the money. But in some cases we have been already successful, and women have got quite a lot of money. Well, not compared to what they have gone through, but compared to what, well, in former days, compensation was not an issue at all, and nobody got anything. Now, through long time awareness raising, at least a little bit of compensation is almost always part of the judicial sentence. And of course, evidently, you can, based on, you also can go to a civil court and say, I have lost so and so much money and I want compensation for that. So this is another possibility. And of course, we are the ones to support the women doing that, based on a contract with the Austrian government. This is part of our work. Okay, I'm with this Philippine woman. She has found there is a place where she can live. I'm also trying to get insurance for her right now, health insurance. We are about to go to the police and specialized police and tell them what happened to her, show them the contract and the difference to what was the reality. And hopefully something can be done about it. As I said, the lady is a diplomat and it's not easy, but she as well will be asked. She will be confronted with what the woman said, and this will at least be, hopefully, a sign for her that she cannot go on like that. So this is really also, when we talk about prevention, we also see that as part of prevention in a very small range now, so that maybe this lady will not do that again because she will have to feel the consequences. Not very big consequences, I admit, but at least she will be confronted what she has been doing. Okay, I think I will stop here because the time is running. We are part of other international projects as well. One for voluntary return for victims, and we have been working out quality standards for that. I have a small brochure on that, which is outside. We are also part of lobbying networks of NGOs on an international level, exchanging best practices whatsoever. And of course, international levels are different. There is the European level, there is the regional level, but there is also the worldwide level. And on the worldwide level, we are part of the GetW, the Global Alliance Against Trafficking in Women, which is quite a good instrument. But if you're interested in it, I can tell you more later. But that's just my statement.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ava. Well, it seems that we've got a number of different perspectives here. And I would like to ask a question to the panel, which is implicit in your presentation, and that is, are governments doing enough? And we've heard from Mr. Ho that in some cases sentences are very light for convicted traffickers. I mean, if there's no real consequence for them, I mean, that's certainly a major issue. We've also heard that that there are 30 countries approximately who have the Tier 1 rating, which means that they're meeting the minimal standards for combating trafficking in terms of prosecution, prevention, and protection. And but there are close to 200 member states in the UN, and there's only 30 that are meeting the minimal standards. So that raises a question of, are governments doing enough? And then, I mean, just even on in this last case where a diplomat is the exploiter of the victim, we know that in the famous case that the film The Whistleblower is based on, it was also diplomats who were involved. And is there can't a country expel a diplomat for violating their laws, or at least tell the government involved that they don't want this person to
I think Austria tried to, but it's not easy.
Yeah. But I'll throw that question open and ask you to also respond to each other's presentation. Maybe we begin with Ambassador.
Well, there's a lot of things to say, but I realize you want to finish in the foreseeable future. Let me start by saying, according to estimates, 50% of victims worldwide come from Asia. Another 25% from Europe, and the rest of the 25% is for what's left, America and so on. So under these conditions, our government's doing enough here. First of all, as I said, the government rightly said, we do have a problem with the judiciary. But the judiciary is not part of the government. I mean, in our terminology, the government is the executive branch and the judiciary is independent from that. And it is one of the difficulties is that it is very difficult to influence in whatever way what the judiciary does. And we also have, of course, Western criminal law, which says you can't punish somebody unless you have 100% proof of what happened. Now, what happened is usually extremely complex, because as described, what are the root causes? Why is it so difficult for a committed Western government to actually prevent something, to actually have success stories which you can show? Because of the root causes. And the root causes are extreme poverty in many parts of the world. The root causes are also types of societies where you have extreme discrimination against certain groups of society, against women, about certain ethnies. You have patriarchal societies where women are by definition dealt with in a rather bad way. You have a very strange new type of newly rich consumer societies which somehow comprises prostitution, and you have corruption. There's practically no human trafficking without some degree of corruption, and there's a lot of corruption around all over the world. So this explains why it is so difficult to have success, even though you try very hard. And I agree, there's not enough prevention going on, even though, I mean, I really cannot avoid saying this now, but awareness raising. I was Googling my way to the Webster University this afternoon via Google Maps, and what do I find? I find your address with an advert on erotic massage. Now, having done this awareness raising with you, now maybe some of you would like to research what's behind this very strange ad which comes up with the Webster University. So this is a case for awareness raising. What could it be? Who's behind that? I would really argue, because of the difficulty of coming to grips with the root cause, it is so difficult. What would it mean? It would really mean combating poverty internationally at a huge scale. And I don't have to explain how difficult that is at times of national austerity plans, the economic crisis, and all that. There is a second element which I would like to link up with, which is what Eva Kaufmann just mentioned, the case of diplomats as employers of victims. We do have such cases. We don't have huge loads, but we have a certain amount of cases, and we really try to do our best, knowing that these people, if they are full diplomats, they have full diplomatic immunity, which means you can't take them to court, at least not as long as they're in their function. But we have developed really a catalogue of measures which we now use for diplomats in order to make it difficult up to impossible for them to employ slaves. One is that we say every person who works in a diplomatic household has to have a legitimation card, which has to be picked up in the foreign ministry. And we now say this person has to come herself or himself. We do not give such legitimation cards to drivers anymore. When these workers come, we tell them exactly what the labor law is in Austria, how much money they are entailed to, which is 15 times a bit more than €1,000 per month. We tell them that they are entitled to have a room by themselves. We request the employers to show a floor plan. They have to show that there is a room attributed to that person. We make sure that that person has a labor contract which is signed by the employer, and we hand them a copy. Not least, we tell them about LEFÖ, which is an organization dealing specifically with female victims of human trafficking, so they know if they have a problem, they can always turn to LEFA, and quite a few of them have done so. So we think this is quite good. We have recently introduced an obligation for diplomats to pay what people gain to an account, to a bank account. So to make sure that we don't have the discussion afterwards that one says we have paid and the worker says I never got anything. We used to have that kind of discussion. We make sure, this is our latest measure, that the worker gets a bank card, a plastic card, because otherwise you cannot really use that account. We make sure that they are registered with their consulates. And I must say the Filipino embassy is very good about that. The Filipinos have a national migration policy. They know they don't have enough jobs in the Philippines for their people, but they try their best to make sure that these people have optimum working conditions abroad. So you see, we have developed a number of measures which we try as a means of prevention. If something gets wrong, if we hear about a case where a worker in a diplomatic household gets exploited, we talk to the embassy. If the employer is not the ambassador himself, it's rather easy to complain to the ambassador, and it will then be an embarrassment for the person who has been the employer. And we would not stop if it were really necessary to declare somebody persona non grata, although we haven't done so yet. But we make it quite clear that we mean it. Even if we can't take these people to court, we can do a lot of develop a lot of nuisance value to make it more difficult to them. Yeah, well, I think I should stop here, even though there are many things to say.
Thank you. And Mr. Ho, let me ask you the same question. Are governments doing enough?
I think it's an easy question because the answer is no. And I'm not sure how you would define enough and when you would ever reach the point where you say with a problem so great that it's now resolved. But I think I'm reminded of the saying that many of us have heard: it's better to light a single candle than curse the darkness. And so I think, in fact, governments are doing more than lighting a single candle, but really local authorities, national authorities, and at the international level. There have been, in just the time I've been in the Foreign Service, a number of steps. The kinds of things that Ambassador Tiki Fieselberger just mentioned, that the Austrians are doing here for the problem of diplomats who are exploiting their personnel using their status. That's, I think, dwarfed by the problem of the people who are trafficked for sexual exploitation, where you don't necessarily have those tools and where you have large criminal organizations that have resources and also a lot fewer scruples. And that's a real issue. Nevertheless, I think the Philippines is a good example. We found in the case of the US report that when we had ranked the Philippines in the lowest tier, that got the government's attention. And it was a very important factor in having that government then put their task force in place and begin to take measures that they themselves could take. As a result, the ranking of Philippines has gone up. There have been, I think, a number of successes with respect to the Philippines in particular. But I go back also to time in Bosnia. There were all kinds of problems. But we got international organizations to adopt a code of conduct. There were some people who were prosecuted. There were some breaking up of rings. We worked to, in an internationally cooperative way, have investigations and arrests and some convictions. You have to count your successes where you get them, and you have to say, well, okay, I can't solve the whole problem, but I'll do what I can. And I think that's an important lesson for individuals as well as governments. I'll just mention very quickly, also my colleagues reminded me, we have some materials outside, including a note from Secretary of State Clinton and President Obama, but also the web address for the Trafficking in Persons report. So if somebody's looking for that, you might check those things out. Or you can go back to Google, although I have no idea what ads will pop up.
Okay, on that note, let's open the questioning to you folks. Any questions from the audience?
Dr. Hirsch, if you allow, I would even like to put 3 small questions. Okay. The first is to Mr. Ho. You mentioned Philippines and Serbia, but basically, isn't it a problem of poor countries which are exploited? and the rich countries which make use or misuse of it. So the misusers are, in the first place, United States and Europe, probably. Couldn't one say this in maybe in simple terms? It's a flow, as in other cases, from poor countries to rich countries. Exploitation of poor countries in a different manner and misuse by the rich countries. Isn't that the basic formula? This is my first question. The second to you, if you allow, Mrs. Kunder, you mentioned the success quote. When I hear on the complexity and all that, I have the impression that the success is well below 1%. So my question is my impression wrong, or would you confirm that? And my third question is to you, Mrs. Ambassador. You mentioned the Romanian girl case. What happened to it? Was she sent back to Romania? You mentioned, Mrs. Kaufmann, that in the ideal case another job is found. This is probably the ideal case. Or is the girl, if not sent back to Romania, which probably she doesn't even like to, is she sent to an institution like Wilhelminenberg, where she is exploited again and misused? So what happens afterwards? Ideally, I admit, another job is found. She can stay, good. But this probably is not the rule and the normal case.
Okay. So not only the students who asked the tough questions.
Maybe you should identify yourself.
My name is Sandra. I'm a retired person, so I have time to attend all kind of interesting
You also work for the German government?
Yes, you are well informed, Dr. Hirsch. I work for the German federal government and the Ministry of Economics and Technology. Then I was responsible for a matter which is not so popular here, namely for nuclear energy.
Well, since you speak German, you asked, is it a question of rich countries versus poor countries? I would answer jein. Yes and no, in the sense that I think it is a question of rich against poor, but not countries, individuals. There are, I think, a lot of victims who are poor who come from countries that may be wealthy themselves, but individually are poor. And I think there are a lot of customers, exploiters, traffickers, who are from poor countries themselves. And certainly I saw that in the Balkans.
The main.
So I think it's not so much a country-to-country issue, but it is an individual one, where the people who are vulnerable are poor, and people who are powerful.
But the flow to which countries is probably in the rich countries. We are the richest people.
I think I think the flows. The experts here can define which way they're going and so forth, and there probably, I think, are, as we heard, a lot coming from places in Asia to Europe and North America. But at the end of the day, I guess what I want to say is I think it's very much a question of individual responsibility, because we've found a lot of governments that themselves are rather poor and have a lot of victims coming from there are still taking fairly strong action to help combat trafficking.
Yeah, just to dwell on this, I would agree. Yeah, because we very often see that this way of another country of destination, very often it's a mix of all three. Yeah, so for instance, Russia, for instance, is a huge country of origin, but also a huge country of destination. Yeah, or what you said, in the United States and also in Europe and other countries, we also have internal trafficking. Yeah, so this has changed, and we have victims of trafficking from European countries a lot, really. So this was surprising, at a certain moment for us. So I agree. It's but of course it's true, and also the countries of origin have changed over the years all the time. Leifer knows this, knows this best, because they know that the people just come from different countries. So it's very complex, and we have to look into that. This by the way, because being at the university, this would be good research matter to look into that, and also into what makes people vulnerable, because we had our cliches. We said, well, the poorly educated, they become victims of trafficking, etc. Nowadays we know it's the highly educated too, and so this is there is a continuous change, and it's not just one issue. Or we would say, well, very often they have suffered violence in their families, so they become then victims of trafficking. But knowing that in Europe, and it won't be much different in the United States, for instance, that every third or fourth girl and boy, are affected somehow by domestic violence, and we would say, well, all those do not become, fortunately enough, do not become victims of trafficking. So these cliches and these simple answers nowadays are not the real answers. We would really have to look into that more, and yeah, fine. If we can do research in this direction, that's fine. And just a word on success. I mean, we should, we are so quick, and everybody needs a success. Whatever we do, we define everything as a success. We have a lot of self-monitoring of what we do, and whatever we do is quickly called a good practice or a best practice. But this, of course, is not true. We have to look into what measures or what responses or what defines a good or a best practice. And is a good practice in one situation transferable to another, or what makes it transferable? And we do not know very much about that. So therefore, there's really research required in this. And just a last remark, because human trafficking is it is a chain of criminal behaviors and of human rights violations. This makes it so difficult. So we have to address all the components along the whole continuum. And if we don't if we just focus on one part, we won't be really successful. But again, we have started. It's not easy, because ministers of the interior in all the countries, they are applauded by, so to say, cleaning up the country or keeping the country clean, which means very often people are sent back to their home countries without being identified as potential victims of trafficking. And as long as we continue doing this, we won't be very successful, because we really help the traffickers. This is what the traffickers want. They always want new people. They don't want people staying long somewhere because they could make friends. They could ask somebody. They could find help or whatever. So this is we support in this way the traffickers, and we know that up to 50% sometimes they just come again in this criminal cycle, or they are apprehended again by traffickers, or they try again. So this is not helpful, and we really have to look into that when we speak about success.
Okay. Do you want to respond about the Romanian case?
Well, incidentally, this is the tragedy about human trafficking, as opposed to drugs dealing or arms dealing or whatever, that you can resell a person many, many times. On the 1% you mentioned, I mean, UNODC estimates that only 1% of victims get saved. But the 1% of victims who do get saved, I think, are treated decently in this country. So the answer to your question is, we have in Vienna an institution called the Drehscheibe, which is attached to the municipality of Vienna, and which deals with child victims of human trafficking. And they take up these children. That incidentally is the institution where that girl first landed and told her story. And they make sure that these children go back to their countries if they can under safe conditions. And if that is not the case, they stay in Austria. We have problems at the moment with sending back children to Romania, as far as I'm informed, because the Drehscheibe helped to build up a system of emergency centers in Romania, which unfortunately has been discontinued now. So this is one of the troubles we are discussing with Romania. I do not know about the particular child, but the procedure would be to make sure that the child can go back to its own country in safe conditions if possible. It happens, for example, that children are sold by their fathers, but can actually be sent back to their mothers and be treated decently. If that's not the case, we look whether there is a social institution in the country where that child could be sent back. If that doesn't work, the child stays in Austria until some solution is found. This is how we deal with it.
Thank you.
I would like to thank you for breaking it down to some real cases so that somebody who lives comfortable in Vienna can imagine actually what is happening and what the government is doing, as you described in the case of this diplomat. You talked a lot about awareness. I mean, what could any person do to become aware that something like this is going on in my immediate environment, for example? I think because this is what it's all about, because you need to reach out to these people.
Well, I mean,
the other questions for me, it sounded that it mainly concerns women, or is that completely wrong?
Yes, it's 80%, we think. What can you do as an ordinary person who is not involved with it at all? There's a hotline, which is run by the Federal Criminal Office, but they have specialists for human trafficking. I can give you the number if you like. What we also do a lot under the title of awareness raising is, of course, training particular groups, professional groups. We train policemen, we train judges if they allow us to train them, because they always insist on being independent. We train consular staff, because we know people who want to come to Austria and bid as victims, they need a visa. So we try to make sure that our consular staff will recognize victims. We try to make sure that medical staff are being trained. So various groups of society, but the ordinary citizen, if you think you have seen a case of human trafficking, you don't have to be a hero or anything like that. All you have to do is inform the right hotline, and they will take it from there.
And you also could, of course, call us,
Yeah.
and we, of course, would help to identify what kind of situation is that. As a neighbor, for instance, as somebody, we quite often actually do have calls from neighbors who have seen something and who want to discuss it and say, what could I do in this situation? I think something strange is happening in the apartment next door. I hear screams. I have once seen a woman trying to escape, but she was then, whatever, taken back. Or I did try to talk to a woman who was in the corridor, but she didn't want to talk to me. She seemed to be very shy, and she seemed to be very much under control. She's certainly not from Austria. She probably speaks German. What do I do? And then we can discuss the situation, and if by the next time meeting this woman in the corridor, passing on a telephone number, for instance, or what would be the possibilities, the resources, and of course, if sometimes it is necessary to decide to call the police and to make the police aware that in this or that house, in this or that address, there is happening something strange. And eventually have them have a look, what's happening there. And there were successes. Of course, there were also false alarms, but you will have those. We, for instance, had the Hungarian embassy calling us just a few weeks ago, because the consul was called by a woman who said, I am working in prostitution, I will be beaten up this evening, very hard, and it will be, please get me out here. So we did call the police, but it turned out that it was not the lady itself who was working in prostitution who alarmed us and the police, but it was her mother who wanted to have her daughter out of this business. So things like that also happen. But just imagine it would have been serious, and we wouldn't have told the police, because who knows if the woman wants that. What happened was the police was talking to this woman, which they already had done a week before, because they had known about this thing with the mother, and asking her, did something happen to her? And she said, no, it's again my mother. And then they were discussing if she would like to go back to the bar, or if she would rather go back home, because evidently she didn't earn a lot as well. And then she decided, she herself, that she would go back home. Okay, so if that is the result, okay.
Any question?
Ms. Moore-Coleman, working for the Economic Chamber of Commerce. Thank you very much for being here and for the very interesting discussions. I would be interested in the following. There was mentioned Tier 1, 2, 3 countries. How can you convince governments, countries to do something about it? Because as you said, preventing trafficking is difficult, costs money, time, etc., and at the end it's all about self-interest. So what are the benefits of doing something about it, against it, and so how can the international community or NGOs convince nations to do something about it?
There's the word on the tip report. I think on the one hand, I think it's an instrument which is understood by governments, because nobody wants to be blamed or shown, as not doing anything. So on the one hand, it's an instrument, I believe, which governments understand quite well. So that's fine. On the other hand, I think there is time to improve and to think what we do, because coming to your question, what should countries do? Because we cannot solve human trafficking with a checklist type of approach. We cannot solve human trafficking with mere minimum standards. This doesn't work, So we would have to see what else can we do? Because the countries, of course, would negotiate. This is what you know, and what all those working on the tip report know. Countries would come and negotiate with you, and then, of course, try to do something, and then it's better. Then it's not tier 2, it's tier 1 or whatever. So this is not really helpful, because in reality this doesn't change very much. But there are two things. On the one hand, this instrument is something, because all together, they are there, they are shown, but on the other hand, I think a bit further development, and perhaps the Obama administration would like to do that.
I think, if I could add, there are two factors. One is how susceptible is the government to pressure, and then how corrupt are they. On pressure, the biggest, some of the biggest problems for trafficking governments that don't do much are ones like North Korea and Sudan. Neither of them has a very highly developed civil society, to put it mildly. They don't have domestic pressure. Whereas in Austria, I'm sure people around this table will be able to explain very well how the NGOs can bring pressure on the government through the media. I know we've got media people here. There's also international pressure, and again, those examples, North Korea and Sudan, ignore international pressure, whether it's on nuclear issues or Darfur or you name it. There have been all kinds of high-level international efforts with great pressure, and the governments ignore that. So that doesn't mean you can't do anything, but they're much more difficult than a society where the government actually wants to do the right thing or is subject, feels the pressure more. And then there's corruption. You may have places where, in fact, and I'm sure you would find some local jurisdictions in the United States where, yes, the framework is there, but an individual judge, police, prosecutor is getting money from a criminal organization to make sure that the law enforcement is unsuccessful one way or another. And that's a problem. So I guess the question then is what do you do? It's how do you engage governments? And that's where I think businesses around the world have a legitimate role. But again, media, civil society, all these things can bring pressure. And I think we found former dictatorships, and there are many when you go just a little bit east of Vienna, where for a long time it seemed nothing was happening. Once the system collapsed, you found, well, actually, people said there was outside pressure on human rights, for example, where people found ways, despite the very strong authoritarian structures, to influence and make the situation less bad. And so I wouldn't say, therefore, look at a country like North Korea and say, oh, too hard, we won't do anything. You have to keep trying with every means that you have.
I can see we still have a number of questions, but we've kind of run out of time. I would like to leave some time for our panelists to be able to talk to you one-on-one in our reception area over a drink. So I think I'm going to call it an end to our session now and invite everyone for a drink outside. I want to thank the panelists, and I want to thank the U.S. Embassy and the Austrian Institute for International Politics for co-sponsoring tonight, and Professor Dorota for initiating this event. This isn't the first time that Webster has done something around this issue. I want to thank Professor Weeks for his work in promoting a conference we held a couple of years ago at the UN on human trafficking, and it's a continuing issue of concern to Webster and our international relations program, and I'm sure we're going to continue to be looking at it.
Yeah.
Okay, on that note, I'd like to invite everybody for a drink in our gallery.